So hello everybody, and I'm really happy to be here. It's my third time in Malaysia, and every time I come here I have a great time, so it's, I hope it's not the last time. I'm going to be talking to you about open source, of course, but more importantly on choosing a business model and a license that works with making money and keeping businesses alive, because the very common thing that I hear when people talk to me about open source is free. So how do you make money with free? And open source is not free. It's free as in free speech, but it's not free as in free beer. In many cases, there is a price to pay for it. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And my past is I've been working for Sun Microsystems for 17 years. You know, we were the big enemies of Microsoft, or they were our big enemies. And then I joined Oracle, and then actually I didn't like it at Oracle, so I didn't stay long. But I was doing open source there for whatever time I spent there. And then when I left Oracle, I started working for a few years with venture capitalists and startups to help them in their strategic choices on software, on hardware, on licensing, on business models, explaining to the venture capitalists how a startup can be interesting for them, helping startups write a business plan, things like that. So I know quite well how it can be important for you to pick the right things like licenses and business model, and more importantly, how to position that towards a venture capitalist when you're going to be talking to them to get some money. So that is with that kind of focus that I'm here. I just 2 weeks ago joined a new company. So now I work in a completely different company. It's called Wipro. You see the logo up here. And Wipro is a huge Indian company. We're over 150,000 people around the planet, and Wipro has just started building a 10,000 people open source practice globally. So for this practice, I am the senior advisor. I'm based in Europe. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland. I live in France and across the border to work, and I cover Europe, Middle East, Africa, a bit of the US, and of course here, since I'm here. All right, so I'm not going to bore you with the rest of the slide. I just had to find it and show it here. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, we're going to be looking at who are... So, by the way, just to give you some idea, this presentation is normally designed for both startups and venture capitalists. So there's some things that are more interesting for the venture capitalists to understand who they're talking to, you guys. Or, and some elements are going to be more interesting for you guys to understand what they need to say to the VCs. So that's why I've kept both, because I think it makes sense in this audience of entrepreneurs to have both perspectives. So, so first we're going to be looking at what a developer is, what an open source developer is. I mean, you know, the image most big companies have of open source people is that they're kids in their garage with Mac or a hacked PC with cables all around, and it really isn't that. So we'll look into that a little bit. Then we'll look at what is source code, what is an open source license, how you define an open source license. Finally, we'll have a very brief slide on hosting the code, and this is really at explaining a VC how an open source startup can be physically set on the net and in places. It's really brief. And then the last part is going to be on business models. So the two parts that are really important will be the licenses and categories of licenses, because that's what's going to help you pick what license you want depending on how you want your customers and your users to use your code. And this, which is how are you going to make money with all this stuff? All right. So first of all, developers. How do we look at who are the developers in open source? And as I said, the image everybody has is the hobbyist, the person who's hacking at code in their garage or in their bedroom. That was my case. I had my computer attached to the wall with cables all over the place. in my bedroom, and I was writing code on this. And typically they do this for what? They do this either because it's fun and they want their name on some project, which happened to me. I had done a translation of a Kama Sutra application for Palm ages ago, and this is my name on it. And my colleagues were like, "Wow, you wrote this." Yeah, I did. So it was fun, and I did it because it was fun, actually. And other types of open source developers will be writing open source code because they are using something, say Pigeon, the instant messenger, and they lack a functionality. It should be integrated with some video application they use or something like that. So they'll hack the code a little bit so that it works better. Probably the next thing I'm going to be doing right now for my Android phone, for example, is hacking into KeePass Droid, which is an application for saving passwords, which can't write to the new SD protected storage on Android 5. And I'm going to probably add a few lines of code for that if I can find the time to do it, but that would be the next thing I'll do. So that's the hobbyist, doing it for fun. Then there is the user patcher. So this is really the person who's a heavy user of an application. Could be an enterprise, user, could be the previous hobbyist that is really using an application and that will want to contribute to it. If you look at, there's a great office environment tool out there called LibreOffice. For example, the easiest way to get involved in writing LibreOffice code is translation, because it's written originally in German. Most of the team is in German. There's some French, English, and then all over the planet. But a lot of the texts are in German, and they're still looking for people to translate that into the native language. And it's nice because it can be done without almost knowing anything about writing code. You just take text files, you look into them, you take another copy of the text file, and you replace the text with whatever your language would have for that. And it's very easy to get involved, actually, in this kind of environment that way. And then, of course, once you've hacked a text file and looked at the headers, it's like, there's another file with headers. I think I can understand this one. Oh, and there's a line here, and you start writing C code or C++ before you know it. So that's a very nice way to do this. And of course, you do this either by providing the fixes and updates yourself, or simply by actually just commenting and reporting bugs, because reporting bugs is a very important part of an open source project, is saying, oh, by the way, this is what happens, and maybe you guys could help me fix it. And sometimes, of course, you end up doing the fixing yourself, which is fun. So these two tend to be the unpaid developers, the one that do things because they really need it or for fun. There is a different context. It's in the enterprise world where you have two types of developers. You would have the corporate contributor. So that's somebody who works for a company and as part of that company ends up developing something that will be useful for the company. So let me give you an example. In 1992, probably some of you weren't born at that time, but in 1992 I was working for a British company. It's called Uniplex, and Uniplex did office automation software, so like MS Office, but in text terminals, and it ran on Unix. And our spreadsheet could output graphics, which was really cool because not many people were doing that. But the graphics were in a proprietary format. And so when a customer actually had our products and generated a graphic and sent it to their customers couldn't read it because they didn't have the same application. So I told my boss, look, there's a tool out there, it's from the GNU project, and it's called, I think it's HP2XX, and it's a converter between graphic formats, and it's open source, and I'm pretty sure that if I take a few weeks of work on it, I can actually write the module that will take our graphic format and convert it to the intermediary format, so then it can be converted to whatever else people want. And that would help our customers, because then their customers could read our files. So they thought about it a little bit, and they said, yep, go for it. So I ended up spending a couple of weeks writing code, posting it, contributing it to the project, and I was still paid by my employer. I was just not doing my normal day job, which was pre-sales, but it was hacking a bit of code to get customers happy. So this is one way to do this, and you end up staying paid for in the same way, so you don't really change roles, but you just work on something for some time. The last category is really a project-oriented developer, and the project-oriented developer is somebody who works inside inside a project, so like the GNOME Foundation or the Apache Foundation or Mozilla or whatever. And these people can be paid either by the foundation themselves. For example, when the Apache Foundation gets money from donators, then they can use that to fund developers. Or it could be contributed by an organization which has a vested interest in getting this to work. At the time when I was at Sun Microsystems, we created a great virtual terminal called a Sunray. And Sunray is kind of like a frame buffer that sits on the network and has display and keyboard, and you can log into your system. And it used GNOME's login mechanism, GDM, on the screen to log in. And the thing is, GDM at the time was written only to log into a physical graphics card on a machine. It needed to share memory with a CPU and things like that. And so on our terminals, of course, it couldn't work since we were seen as a remote display with no shared memory. So what we did is we said, okay, we will contribute to the GNOME project the whole support for virtual displays. And why contribute it instead of just writing it for ourselves? Because once it's contributed, then it gets maintained by the GNOME project, probably by our engineers there, but it gets maintained by the GNOME project so that in the next release of GNOME, it's still there and we don't have to port it again and again and again. So it's interesting because by contributing something to the GNOME project, we made it all easier for us. The other thing we did, and we were the core contributor of that, is write the Orca accessibility API for people who have hard time reading, listening, etc. So again, because Sun is an international company and was selling product to governments all around the place, we had to have accessibility built into our graphical environment, which was GNOME. So we basically wrote, contributed the most time to the Orca API. And so this is done when you contribute as an organization. This is done either by donating money to the Apache Foundation and they can pay a developer, or donating a developer or lending a developer for some time. So saying, Gilles, here, you go work at Apache for 2 months or 5 months, and what you do there will be helpful for us as well, so we're going to pay you for that. And so those are the general categories, and I'm sure you can find some others that I've missed, but and actually if you do find, and I'll take advantage of this moment to say, this should be an interactive presentation. So if you have questions, raise your hand or scream or whatever. So if you see, since there will be a few slides where I list things, if you see me missing a category somewhere, tell me, I'll add it for the next time I do this presentation. So as I said, these are the general categories of the developers, and it's important because I want venture capitalists, for example, to understand that when they're talking about open source, they're not always talking about these guys, but they can be talking about people who have a lot of money, big companies who are providing a significant amount of resources to projects. Okay, so the next one, you probably, well, depending on how much of a developer you are or not, you might be aware about some of this stuff, but when somebody writes a program for a computer, nowadays, we tend to use something like this, which is code that developers can understand. I'm not sure my sister understands this, but she qualifies as a human, but she doesn't understand that. My father doesn't either, though. But that's what you write on a computer. And by the way, question, anybody knows where this code is from? You have 5 seconds to guess, or to Google it. Yeah? Yeah? You listened to my talk a few days ago. So anyway, it's actually from OpenSSH, not OpenSSL. It's from OpenSSH, and it was my mistake last time. So this is the random number. It's part of the random number generation of OpenSSH. And by the way, there were huge bugs found recently in the crypto stacks, and thanks to open source, they were actually found and patched. So it's interesting to have the code that's accessible to the public because they can look at it instead of just having, as I had a discussion yesterday evening, I was asked, not yesterday evening, this morning, jet lag. I was asked, what is more secure, closed proprietary code or open source code? And my answer was, if you take closed proprietary code, the good guys can't look at it, of course, because it's not accessible. But the bad guys, they can. Why? Because they steal the code. They'll bribe somebody, they will threaten somebody, they will kill somebody, and they will steal the code. When I was a student, I had the code of VMS, the source code of VMS. Anybody remember VMS? Okay. Yeah, you have the same kind of hair as I do. VMS is the operating system that ran on VAX mainframes. Nobody remembers VAX either, but they were big machines that fit into this room. And the operating system was completely proprietary. And so nobody had access to the source code, which is a pity because there's some really fun lines in that source code. Like you'd find out that when you boot the machine, you had a certain amount of time before you could set the system time, and the unit for that time was micro fortnights. Nobody uses micro fortnights, of course, because you have to know what a fortnight is, and a fortnight is 15 days. And so a micro fortnight is 1.6 seconds. And so it's only by reading the code that you understood why you only had so much time to set in the system date. Of course, reading source code helped you find bugs and vulnerabilities and break into the machine. And of course, since the good guys didn't have it, the good guys couldn't fix it. Now, that's what you write in terms of code. When you're going to be using an application, your computer doesn't run this. In most cases, they run an interpreted, optimized version of this. Some languages are interpreted and they run this, Python. But most computers run binary. Binary is a series of zeros and ones, which is used by today's processors. Of course, in my times, you could also program computers in binary. In your time as well, I suspect. But nowadays, nobody really programs in binary because it's just impossible to manage. Why am I showing this? Because when we're talking open source, we're going to see a difference between having access to the binary and having access to the source code. If you have a program in binary form, it's very hard to modify it and understand what it's doing. It's feasible. It needs very complex tools for reverse engineering. And sometimes it's actually even illegal to do that in some countries. Whereas having access to the source code makes it easy, especially if it's nicely commented like this, makes it easy to read what's going on in the program and find where you can either fix or add or remove things you want, don't like, would like better. Now, the question is, how do I make a user, how do I allow a user to get access to the source code if I'm making the binary available to them? Well, that's what open source is all about. And in order to do open source, the key element, so open source can be seen as two things. It can be seen as a way of developing by sharing code, etc. Or it can be seen from the licensing perspective. And that's what I'm going to look at right now. Open source from a licensing perspective. And so what happens is that the way you let your users use your application is defined by a license. It's a sort of contract. And in some countries, by the way, a contract needs to be signed. Like France would like people to sign both sides of the contract, and license are a little confusing for the French, but they sort of understand it anyway, so it's accepted. In the US, it's more easy because you can have something like a unilateral agreement, which is not an agreement because to agree you have to have two parties, but it's a unilateral document that says this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you have to do, and in order to use the program, you have to adhere to those rules. So that's what a license is, and open source is really defined by what's in the license. So there's an organization which is called the Open Source Initiative. That's their website here. An Open Source Initiative has looked into a whole bunch of open source licenses, actually a whole bunch of licenses, and said, okay, we are going to set the rules that define what an open source license is. Meaning, if I have a license that I claim is open source, it should satisfy these rules, and there are 10 of them, and they're published on their website. They're explained. And if I'm going to create my own license and want to be able to say that it's open source, it should satisfy these 10 rules. On the other hand, if I'm going to pick an open source license, I know that it will satisfy these 10 rules. So what the Open Source Initiative does actually is publish a whole set of licenses and say these are approved because they satisfy these rules. We're going to look a little bit into these rules because those are exactly what you as developers or entrepreneurs need to think of when you will decide which license to use, because they have an impact on how you use your code. So the first one means that if I'm distributing to you an application and it's open source, the source code must be freely redistributable, and as also must be available. So as a user, I should be able to say, I want access to the source code of this. And as a user, I should be able to take this source code and redistribute it, and actually redistribute even binary forms that have source code freely. So this is what makes people usually say open source is free, because if even me, I purchase an open source application, I can ask for the source code, and by the way, I can be asked to pay for it, but it should be something that corresponds more to the cost of distributing that source code to me rather than a commercial transaction. So I can't be charged $10,000 for a source code. It should be like the postal and the cost of a CD and something like that, but nothing, they're not supposed to make money on the source code. I should be able to get it for more or less free. So once I have that source code, I can recompile it and I can give to anybody else the resulting binary. So that's what makes people say, oh, open source must be free, because there's no point in buying it. Once somebody has it, they can recompile and give me the binary. Now, the other rule is, and that's really interesting, is allow derived works. So this means that if I'm getting a binary for somebody and I get access to the source code, I am allowed to modify it and use this modification in whatever way I want. So this lets me tune, adapt, fix, enhance, reduce stuff. So for example, if I'm getting a media player from France, and that media player actually prevents me from reading non-French DVDs, because if it's open source, I'm allowed to remove that limitation in the source code. So it could be tricky legally to have some type of applications. For example, if in France, legislation, I'm citing France because it's the case, doesn't allow me to break the encryption of a DVD. If somebody is making available an open source DVD player in France, they're allowing me to break the encryption on the DVD. So they're giving me a tool that allows me to break the rule and the law. This happened a few years ago. Anybody know the company called Linksys? Yeah, you all know Linksys. They make little routers, Wi-Fi routers. Okay, so they had a very, very popular model which was called the WRT54G. It was a Wi-Fi router, little blue and black boxes with two antennas. And it worked well, was cheap, worked really nicely. One day, somebody hacking into the box realized that actually it was running Linux, which Linksys didn't tell anybody, but it was running Linux. Micro C Linux. And so what happened is that people said, oh, wait, it's Linux. It's open source. And I'll go into the details of why they realized this, but oh wait, it's Linux, it's open source. This means that I can ask for the source code. And of course, Linksys says no way. Everybody got into trouble, legal, lawyers, FSF, etc. Finally, Linksys did the right thing. And for all of their open source based products, they now have an open source download center where you can download the source code of all of the firmware of the Linksys routers that have, or Linksys components that have open source. All of it, and again, next slide I'll explain what this, why all, but the thing that happens is that in the source code that they published was the source code of the Wi-Fi chipset. Now this is really important for later. What people did with the source code is they built custom versions of these routers with custom firmware. There's a Spanish company called Fawn, which makes a shared Wi-Fi hotspot where once you're a subscriber, you get free access to all of the hotspots. It's really nice. And so they became extremely popular for hackers and companies that use this hardware as the basis of their own stuff. Cool. And then somebody realized that because the drivers of the Wi-Fi chipset was provided and allowed software configuration of the transmission power of the Wi-Fi chipset, all of the custom firmware is allowed to take your normal Wi-Fi at 42 milliwatts and push it to 200 milliwatts, which increased the range of the Wi-Fi router and was really nice. I do that at home. It's great. It just blasts microwaves in everybody's brain. But apart from that, it means that you cover more of your house with Wi-Fi. That was all good until in countries like France, again, because I'm in France, so I know the case of France, the Telecoms Regulation Authority came and knocked on the door of Linksys and said, hey guys, you're selling dirt cheap, easily modifiable devices that allow their users to actually circumvent the French regulation on telecoms and push the Wi-Fi transmission power beyond 42 milliwatts, which is the law, to 200 milliwatts, which is illegal. So we can't let you sell this in France. Now, this was probably the best-selling product of Linksys at the time, and they couldn't sell it anymore. So they got in really big trouble, and they were really upset. So what did they decide to do? They created the next generation, the WRT54G, which was not based on Linux anymore, but on VxWorks, which is a proprietary microkernel, which has the advantage of being smaller. So the newer versions of the WRT54G actually are cheaper because they have less RAM and smaller CPUs, etc. So it was actually nice for them, but all of a sudden, no hacker wanted to buy these machines. None of the OEMs like Fon, etc. wanted to buy the hardware. So they started losing sales because people were complaining. So they said, okay, so we'll make a new generation of WRT54G, which we will sell also, the 54GL, L for Linux, and that one will have the same old Linux, but it'll be more expensive. So if somebody wants a dirt cheap router, they'll buy the 54G, they can't hack into it. And if they're a hacker, a hobbyist, or an OEM will strike a special deal and get special pricing anyway, they can still buy a Linux-based version. So because of this, they had to completely publish their source code, change their business model, modify the versions. So you have to be very careful, because that has an implication for you as well. When you're going to select code that you're going to bring into your project, it might have an influence. If your project is supposed to be proprietary, but you use open source product inside, somebody can actually ask for the source code of that. And we'll see, next slide, that some license actually will have an impact on your code as well. Next slide, I will talk about this. Some more points. Integrity of author source code. This means that if I get an open source program and I ask for the source code, if the source code has been modified, I have to be told what has been modified and where it comes from. So I should always be able to find what was the original version and how it was modified, just so that if somebody tricks something into that, adds DRM into a video player or something nasty, I should know. Also, the next 5 and 6 points are the no discrimination against person or groups or fields of endeavor. That means that if I'm going to create my own open source license, I cannot say, I'm sorry, but this license cannot be used in the USA, if I'm a Russian hacker, or in China, if I'm a Tibetan hacker, or something like that. Or it cannot be used to do some kind of activities, like anybody here know what the CERN is in Europe, the big nuclear research organization? So it's an international research organization, and they study the origins of the universe, they study atomic interactions, very, very fancy stuff. And their charter says that all of their work cannot be used to develop nuclear weapons. It is forbidden to use their work to do nuclear weapons. So when they started writing code and publishing it, they created their own license that said, you can share the code, blah, blah, blah. It's almost open source, but you can't use this for nuclear weapons. And this violated that point. So when they offered open source initiative to review their license and say if it's an open source license or not, the open source initiative said, nope, it's not, you can't. So they had to think a little bit and say, okay, so what do we do? Do we keep our license and not call it open source? Or do we change? So they decided to actually change, so they threw away their license. They decided to use a generic open source license. And the only thing that they say is that, oh, by the way, if you're using this stuff to do nuclear weapons, we won't help you. You can, of course, but don't ask us for support. So it's tricky, because sometimes you'd want to say, you know, like, I don't want this to be used to crack protected video files, or this shouldn't be used for breaking cryptography, because, you know, I don't like breaking, I like breaking cryptography, but some people don't. So you can't. In an open source license, you cannot restrict the field of endeavor or who uses it. The license must be distributed with the code. So if you're going to write or use open source blocks, the license must ship with the code. And that doesn't mean the whole text of the license must ship. Sometimes just a pointer to the license works. Like if it's a very famous license, the GPL, You just need to say it's GPL v2 and people will find it. There's a license that I like a lot that you can look for, actually in terms of licenses, and it's not so well known that you might actually want to quote it. It's called the do what the fuck you want with it license, and it's one paragraph, and it says you can use this and do what the fuck you want with it. But it's a fun license. It's a very permissive license, and so it lets people. By the way, it's not an open source license because it doesn't ensure author source code, so it doesn't mandate that the name of the author be maintained. So it's not an open source license, but it's very permissive. Okay, licenses must not be specific to a product. This means that if you are going to create your license, some teams want to do that. By the way, when I joined Sun Microsystems, we had over 200 different licenses, each created by every project team, and it was a mess because nobody knew which one did what, and we had lawyers for each team, and we decided to actually reduce that. So when I say if you want to create your own license, don't. Use an existing one. But really, if you do, think about this. You cannot create a license that is specific to a product. So if you create a license that is for your web application, well, you cannot call it an open source license and you cannot publish it. If you look at the Mozilla public license, initially it was called Firefox license and applied to Firefox, and now it's Mozilla and applied to any product. It was just written by Mozilla, but it can be used for anything. It must not restrict other software. So you cannot say, because I think Microsoft is not good for open source, and it's a joke, this product is not allowed to run in the Windows environment because I don't like their open source strategy. You can't. When you write an open source license, you cannot restrict other software. The same way as your license has to be technology neutral. So you cannot create a license that is designed for smart cards, because that wouldn't be technology neutral. It has to be a license for software, if it's a software license, or for hardware, but it cannot be for a specific technology. So that's important. You can create a license that's not technology neutral, but it won't be called open source. Okay? So this is what an open source license has to satisfy. Now, there are hundreds of licenses that can be called open source. Yeah, I have a bit of time. So there are hundreds of licenses that can be called open source, and I'm going to characterize and categorize, and I realize that it's not the only way that you can categorize them, but I am going to categorize them in 3 different categories based on how permissive they are and how they're impacted by copyleft or not copyleft. So the first type of license is the most permissive licenses, and they're usually called non-reciprocal or non-copyleft as well. And those are licenses that basically let you use the stuff, do more or less what you want with it, like to do whatever you want with it, but still have the attribution and various elements of an open source license. And because these licenses don't actually enforce things like contribution and things like that, they're the most permissive. And the typical license you'd find there would be Apache, for example. The Android operating system comes with the Apache license. There is the Internet Systems Consortium license. Have you heard of something called Ripple? Ripple is a platform and a protocol for exchanging things like bitcoins. It's done by a company which is called Ripple, and they created a license they're using a license which is called the ISC license, and it's a very permissive license. You can basically take their code, you can integrate it into a proprietary system, you can hack the code, you can modify stuff, add stuff. It's okay. Do whatever you want with it. The next generation, the next category of license is the file level reciprocal license. These licenses mean that if you have an open source project that you're going to integrate with your code, every file that comes originally from that project has a license, and if you modify one of these files, the modified file needs to remain with that license. So if it was an example, an MPL or a GPL file, it needs to keep that license or a compatible one. But if you add stuff to it, that stuff can have any kind of license. So as an example, if you take an MPL licensed program, say LibreOffice, and if you want to add stuff to it, your own, Your own stuff does not have to have the same license. It could actually even be proprietary. So you could take LibreOffice, because it's MPL, and package it with a completely proprietary printing engine or a commercial application that you're developing for lawyers or for doctors or whatever. And that's okay, because the license here only says that if you modify stuff in LibreOffice, the modifications need to be made available in source code because they stay with the MPL license. But anything you add can be whatever you want. Okay? And the only thing that happens is that you have to keep the license for whatever initially you had, but the rest can be whatever you want. Whereas with something like BSD, you can bundle all of that, you can modify stuff, you can do like what, for example, what Apple did. Apple built Mac OS on top of a BSD kernel, and they modified the BSD stuff so that they could put their own environment on top of it, and there's no way they're going to tell you what they modified and how they modified it. The only thing they'll tell you is based on FreeBSD, and here's FreeBSD. What we did to it, not your problem. Okay, so BSD license lets them do that. MPL would force them to tell you how they modified the original BSD files, but they could still add their proprietary stuff to it. The last category is the project level reciprocal licenses. Now, these means that inside a project, everything will be touched by the license. Everything that is touched by the license will be modified to that license and will be, in a way, contaminated. So we call these licenses viral. If you have, for example, the GPL, that the license of Linux is one such license, it says that if you take a project that has this license, any file that you modify in it must have the same license or compatible. Any file you add to it as part of your project must have that same license. So if you look at, stepping back to what I said about Linksys earlier, in their router, so the router is an appliance, which means it's a project all by itself. Inside the router, they had a Linux kernel, and then they had also drivers for the Broadcom chipset, which Broadcom usually doesn't publish their drivers, so they're not open source. But because all of that was inside one single project, when people asked for the source code, actually they were obliged, well, Linksys was obliged to give them under a GPL license all of the source code, including the Broadcom source code. Now that's tricky. That's tricky because they might not have the right to do that. Maybe Broadcom could have said, oh, sorry, we are not going to let you do that. And you're going to have to pay a hefty fine to get to that point. Of course, it wouldn't have worked too much, but that could happen to you. If you take a GPL product, say a Linux kernel, and you bundle it inside your own project, you have to be really careful because your own project will have to be with a GPL type of license, which means that even if your code, you own the copyright to it and you can change the license of your own code, if you're also bundling somebody else's code, say Acrobat's PDF engine, then you could get into serious legal trouble because if you bundle Acrobat's PDF engine with Linux in an appliance, all of that has to be GPL. So it can lead to very serious legal problems. So you have to take that into account. When you pick your license, and that's going to be the summary for this part, when you pick your license, look at it this way. An open source license gives you permission in advance to innovate via using, studying, improving, and sharing the code. That's the user's perspective, and that's what they like. As a developer, you have to also add to this that an open source license lets you control and force what your users, if they're developers, will be allowed to do or will have to do with your code. So, as an example, and I'll bring back my slide here. I'll give two Sun Microsystems examples. One of them is when we created Open Solaris. We had an operating system, it was proprietary. We turned it into an open source license and an open source software. And the license we selected for it was called the CDDL. We created it, we had it OSI approved, it's an open source. It's still there, you can still use it. It's kind of like the MPL, but it protects the developers from litigation. It has the benefit of protecting the developers from legal issues. If they use your original code, they can't be sued for it. So it's nicer in corporate environment. But we chose this type of license because we wanted people to be able to take Solaris and integrate it into proprietary devices like printers or switches or routers and add whatever proprietary code they wanted to it. So that was a perfect license for this. The other product we did, which was not really software, it was a microprocessor, the UltraSpark microprocessor, a very fancy multi-threading processor. We decided to open source that, and we open sourced it with the GPL license. Why the GPL? Because we said to ourselves, what we really would like people to do is take this processor, of course, open source. We like universities to study processor design on it without having to pay anything, so that the engineers, when they come out, they know our processor. But more importantly, we'd love companies to build from these processors, maybe new types of processors like a microcontroller. If you look at today, the most common microcontrollers, they either have an Intel 8085 core or a RISC R3000 core if they're 64-bit. So there's all modern microcontrollers, or ARM now, were built on a standard processor with extensions like I/O ports, etc. So we really wanted people to do that, to take our own processor and build a microcontroller based on it. And we wanted that if they did that, they contributed back to us everything they modified and added. So maybe we could do the same thing later on. So we really picked the license because we thought ahead of time, this is what we want to make sure happens if somebody uses our code. And that's what you have to do. As a developer or as a CEO or a CTO of a company that's going to be writing code, using open source code, and possibly a mix of proprietary code, is think of what licenses the open source blocks you're taking, what they have, and if you're writing code yourself, what licenses you're going to be using as well. And you want to make sure that first of all the licenses talk to each other, but more importantly, that they allow other developers or users to do what you want them to do, or sometimes force them to do that. Okay, so those are the last two slides of my presentation. So the first one is going to be reasonably fast, is how do you host your code and the development team? So this is really to help VCs understand how startups work these days. A lot of them do understand, but still. So first of all, the most important thing is things should be hosted on the cloud. I'm not going to contradict my colleagues from Microsoft here. If stuff is hosted on the cloud, it means that a startup doesn't have to buy hardware. And when you're presenting your business plan to an investor, you tell them the money you're investing in the startup is not money that's invested in hardware that we'll throw away in 5 years or if we fail, but it's really money invested into IP, processes, knowledge, teams, etc. So everything that you put on the cloud is less to invest from an investor. The last thing an investor wants to hear is, oh, we have to buy $500,000 worth of servers now because the product is scaling and we don't have the money, so we can't scale. Our customers are unhappy and they're leaving. So you want to be on the cloud, you want to flip a switch and add $500,000 worth of server, but just pay $20 more per month. So that's really probably the most important thing, is use the cloud. If you're going to be building something that needs to scale, or even if it doesn't need to scale, you can host your administration. You can host everything on the cloud these days, so use it. The next thing is, and that comes back to what I said earlier, think about licenses. Think about license madness. The license madness refers to the fact that when you have multiple products with multiple licenses, some of them are compatible with each other, and you really need a lawyer for that. And some of them don't talk well to each other. So for example, if you have GPL and LGPL code, they can talk to each other. If you have, well, some licenses just don't like that. So you want to take that into account as well. Hosting your code. Since you're going to be running your application on code, you might as well host your code on the cloud as well. There are a whole bunch of repositories. So SourceForge is for the old timers. I still use these days, but nowadays most people tend to look at things like GitHub. So have a look at that and explain. Be ready to explain to your investors why your code is hosted there instead of in very protected machines inside your offices where nobody can look at it. And of course, if you're developing open source, it makes a lot of sense to have the code visible. Communities. One thing that is very useful in the open source world is that since your code is available to your users, if the application is popular, there will be users that are going to start modifying your stuff, providing feedback, adding features, and they're going to be doing your work for you, for free. So making sure that the community out there is happy with what you're doing is probably a key element in the success. If the community is unhappy with what you're doing with the product, many things will happen. They can actually take a copy of what you're doing, because it's open source, and do what is called a fork. That take the copy and then make a competing product with that copy. There was a company called Nessus, there still is a company called Nessus, and Nessus was doing a very famous vulnerability scanner. It's an application that hits websites with and servers with all known vulnerabilities and find which ones are not patched, which one can lead to break-ins and theft of data, etc. And that product was open source until version 2. At this point, Nessus decided that they didn't like the fact that they couldn't make money out of it because they didn't know how to. So they said, okay, from version 3 onwards, it will be closed source. Sorry guys, you won't have access to the source code. What do you think happened? Well, people took the source code of Nessus 2.0 and created something called Open Nessus, which competes now with Nessus 3, but it's a completely separate product. And that's normal. In the open source world, a fork, which is taking a snapshot of the source code and making something new with it, is a very normal process. It can be a healthy one when people say, okay, from now on for this product, we'd like to work on something new, but it doesn't yet belong in the main product, so we'll do it on our side. And sometimes these forks merge again when everybody's happy with everything that has been done. And sometimes they say they started as a different product, and that's okay too. It can be for negative reasons when somebody's unhappy. When Sun started working on Open Office, so Sun bought Star Division, which had something called Star Office, which was a commercial office suite. Then Sun turned that into open source and called it Open Office. And it was good, it was popular, it was used in many places. But the community didn't like the fact that Sun would not let the community use the name Open Office for other developments, the logo with the little seagulls, and the graphics for the file icons. And the community was saying, well, you know, we should be able to use the same. If we do a competing product or a parallel product or a fork, we should be able to use all of these so that the users don't feel lost if they're using a different product. And Sun's response was to say, no, we're sorry. This is really our trademark for these things. You can use the source code all you want. You can do whatever you want with it. It's GPL, LGPL at the time. But don't touch the graphics. That's our trademark. And so because Sun was a nice player in the open source world, the community complained but didn't do anything because it was, you know, Sun wasn't there to hurt them. It's just their rules. And then Oracle acquired Sun. And so Oracle had not as much a nice reputation as Sun in terms of open source, but nevertheless, the community went to see Oracle and said, okay, look guys, we know you have different rules, so how about we use the name Open Office, the logos, 2 minutes. Oh my. For a break, okay, good, and then we'll do business models afterwards. Okay, so so they asked Oracle, could we use these things, the logo, the bitmaps, etc. And Oracle said, in much less polite terms as Sun, because I knew the guy at Oracle who did it, really blew them off and said, you go away. We don't want to hear about you. So the community said, okay, it's like that, fine, fork. They took the source code and they created LibreOffice. And with LibreOffice, they made the name, the logo, the things, Creative Commons, everything was public, everybody could use it. So now anybody can write a version of LibreOffice that uses the same graphics for the files. So when you know you have a spreadsheet, it's the same graphic for everybody, even if it's not exactly LibreOffice, but it's Law Office if you've made a special version for your lawyers, or Dental Office if you've made a special version for dentists. So that's what happened. The original company was not managing the community nicely. The community took the source code, did a fork. It also happens if a company, like Oracle again, decides to drop a product and say, okay, sorry guys, we're not interested in doing this anymore. They did this with the Open Identity Stack of Oracle. and of Sun at the time, and then Oracle. They basically dropped it. They said, we're not doing anything more. Customers, bye-bye. You have 3 months of support, and then it's done. Customers were not happy. So what happens is a group of people took the source code of all that and created a company called Fordrock, which does open identity stack based on the old Sun stuff. And initially, they just did it so that they could patch it for their users and maintain it so that it kept on working. And then the users started saying, oh, yeah, you know, it's really cool, this stuff. We'd like to have that and that. Can you add this and an identity? And so Fordrock started growing and making this product evolve into a really nice set of products. And they're not today at a point where they compete with Oracle in terms of product. But Oracle hates them because they keep hiring the best developers from Oracle to work on their product. So, I mean, it can be really bad if you mess up with your community and the product is open source, somebody will pick it up. And as long as people are interested in the product, you can't just stop it because people will find the source code of the N-1 version and keep working with it. Okay. One last element and then we break out. Is how do you guarantee that your product will stay open, ideally, and neutral from influence? There's several ways to write products in open source. It can be done inside a company. Your company could do it. Sun was doing that quite a bit. A nice way, doesn't work everywhere from a legal perspective, but one nice way to do this is to create a foundation. You create an external structure that accepts funding from various sources, etc., and that will be the owner of the source code. And a foundation is interesting because it's not linked to a person, so it cannot be like directly attacked and legally and things like that. So it's a very nice way of ensuring that a project will stay neutral. It's also interesting because you can create a charter for the foundation so that, say for example, the Document Foundation, which does LibreOffice, they do not accept donations of more than 10,000 euros per member. So there cannot be a member that says, I'm going to pay $20 million and I'm going to say, because I paid that, you do what I want. It's just not possible. The charter of the foundation prevents it. So it's a very nice way of saying, there's this entity here, here are the rules, and these rules will set to guarantee that it stays neutral and open forever. And that's a great way of making your users confident that a product is not going to go in a strange direction. I will stop here. The next slide will be, we'll call it a discussion on open source business models after the break. So welcome back for the last part, and the last part is one slide, but I'm going to talk a lot on it. It's actually the open source business models. So again, it's a list. And I've tried to summarize the main business models you can find. And I'm sure that you can imagine other business models, and they often will tend to be a combination of these. Nevertheless, if you have an idea of a different business model that I haven't listed there, please tell me, unless you want to keep it for yourself because it's going to be your new idea and it's the only way you're going to make really money. But if you think it makes sense for the others, do tell me, and I might add a few lines here. I had forgotten to write training, for example, and services, and when I was speaking in Singapore, somebody mentioned it, so I just modified and added training. So this is a dynamic and living presentation. I will add stuff to it if it makes sense. So what I've done here is I've basically put into a few categories of various ways that people can make money with open source. Because as I said earlier, since it's usually very easy to redistribute the software in one form or another, it encourages people using it freely. And so you're going to want to find a way to make some money. So the first way, probably the most easy way when you're writing something that is open source, is that if you own all of the intellectual property on it, you have to be able to do it, or else it can be illegal, of course. But if you can, is to make it available under 2 different licenses. One open source and one not necessarily open source. And you can make available the product that is not open source for a commercial, for a fee. And if you want people to buy that product, it has to have some added value, of course. I mean, if you sell the exact same product as the free version, people are going to think, not long, and then they're going to get the free version. But for example, there's an open source intrusion detection system called Snort. Anybody know Snort? Okay, so a few people know Snort. So for those who don't know Snort, Snort is a great tool. You set it up near your firewall and it looks at what's going on and it will detect patterns of intrusions that are typical. And it will raise a warning and tell you, oh, somebody's trying to do a denial of service, I'm trying to do an SQL injection, somebody's trying to do this or that. It's a great tool. It's a really hard tool to use, so normally if you don't have a degree in computer science and security, it gives you so much information that it's useless, but if you know how to use it, it's a great tool. So the company that makes that, which is called Sourcefire, has an interesting view. They write Snort, and they sell Snort. And they sell version N. And they publish version N-1 as open source. So you buy the product so that you have the greatest and latest. And if you're okay to wait a little bit, you can get it for free as open source. And that's a great way to make money because if you're really interested in having something extremely performing, the last version with the last updates, etc., you pay for it and you get it. They also sell an appliance that runs the latest and greatest Snort engine. So that again is commercial, and of course you pay for the hardware and the software that's inside, etc. So that's a dual license. It can come also with a bit of what's in point number 2. Point number 2 is a subscription model. You could say my piece of code is free, but if you want support for it, if you want to be able to call somebody at 3 o'clock in the morning the day before Christmas because your shop is not working and you're making 90% of your yearly revenue during these 5 hours before Christmas, so you want somebody to respond really fast, well, you'll pay for that subscription and you'll generate money for my company. So that can be a way. The software is available for free. If you want support, we'll sell you a support contract for whatever value. Today, if you look at a company like Oracle, half of the revenue on software comes from support. So it's a significant amount of money over the year. I mean, you buy the software, you can use it for 10 years and then they'll sell you a new license. But during those 10 years, you're also going to want to support, and that will come at a price. So it's interesting, and you can actually combine, of course, the two. You can say you can buy the closed source product and we will sell you support for the years. You could actually have support included for 1 year, somebody who buys it, and then you switch to a subscription-based support. You can combine, and you can combine all of these models actually. There is another mode which is the hosted mode. Not everybody can run a full-fledged data center in their office or in their building, and sometimes they will want to. I mean, if you're a government and you want your data to be protected from other governments, you will run it internally. But in some cases, it's just too complex to run software, and so you're going to host it on somebody else's cloud, like Microsoft's Azure, like Oracle's Oracle On-Demand Cloud, which is very proprietary stuff, or it could be on Amazon Web Services or Google or whatever. So one great way is just that, is to say, we make this software accessible to you, and if you pay, you can use it on our cloud. And you'll get a service level agreement that guarantees that you have it up and running 99.999 whatever % of the time, and you pay for that. And we take care of everything else. We make sure it runs, we make sure it's updated, we make sure it's fixed, we make sure it's backed up. Dropbox is a perfect example of that, or Facebook is exactly that. I mean, you can build your own social network. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, and you'll have 5 users on it. But if you want to leverage the infrastructure of somebody else, it's great to use it hosted. Salesforce, it's not open source, but it's a great way to use a very fancy customer relationship management system that's not running in your office, but on somebody else's office. And so typically, it makes the software available as a service, and some of these clouds can just run the software on the net, and some of them can actually also host your data to run the software on. All combinations exist, and if you're going to be offering that as a service, you can think of those as well. if you're going to be hosting the data as a startup, you will have to think about things like protecting the data, backing it up, securing it, etc. If you're just hosting the application, then there's one thing less to worry about, but you'll have to connect to somebody else's cloud to handle that. So that's another great way to make money, is to tell the users, yeah, you can download this, it's open source, but let us run it for you. It's easier, and then you make money out of it. And this brings me, by the way, to something I forgot to mention when we were talking about licenses. I mentioned the GPL. The GPL is a license that uses the notion of distributing code. If I make my software available to you, you download it, or I ship it to you on a CD, then you are bound by the GPL. And as a developer, I am bound by the GPL as well, which means you can ask the code for me and I will have to give it to you, etc. That's all well and nice when the distribution is made in physical means or pseudo-physical means, meaning I give you a copy of it and it's yours and now you can use it. But nowadays, people have more modern means or different means of distributing code, like hosted. If my software is running on my servers and you are using it, is that considered a distribution? Well, the GPL says no, because the copy doesn't leave my servers. So if I'm taking a GPL code and putting it on my server and you're using it, you can't ask me for the source code. Fine for me, not fine for you. Not fine for the author, because then I don't have to submit my modification and things like that either. There are other means. For example, if I ship Linux inside a device and I sell it to you, that's distribution. Now, if you're renting a service from me, like for example, I'm your internet service provider, and for as long as you rent the service, I make available to you a hardware device that's a router that connects to the phone line and gives you internet. But once you stop paying for your internet service, you have to return it to me. Is that distribution? For the GPL, it isn't. And there have been lawsuits in France to that effect. It isn't. If I rent something to you, so not a device but software, you can use the software for as long as you pay for it. Once you stop paying for it, you have to turn it off and remove it from your servers. That's not distribution according to the GPL. So there's a group of people who decided that they wanted to bring all these new modern means of distribution, hosted, rented, on loan, etc., to the world of licensing. And they've created something called the Affero GPL license, or the AGPL. Now that's important because if you're going to be developing software libraries, software tools that are designed to run in a hosted environment, and you still want your users to be bound by that license, don't pick the GPL for your code, pick the AGPL, because then if one of your customers or users is downloading your code, putting it on their servers and making it accessible to their customers as a hosted service, then the AGPL says that these guys have to contribute back to you modifications, update, and things like that, and they have to give the code license, the code source to their customers. If that's what you want, GPL is not enough. AGPL, Affero GPL is good. So that's hosted. Another mode of making money is services. Now that's what Wipro does, by the way, services. So we know what it means to make money off of open source. We do a lot of open source development. We contribute to projects. We usually, when we partner with an open source team, we take a strong role into developing and contributing to that project. We also have our own developments internally. But what we really do is we really make money by selling consulting and training services. So any kind of service around, that could be support as well, any kind of service around a product is value add for the customer. Customer is going to want that service because they don't have the expertise, and they're going to pay for it. So for example, there's a company that was called by the name of their product, JBoss. JBoss is an application server, and the guy who founded the company, actually, I'm very jealous of him, no, not, but he joined Sun Microsystems a few months after I did in France. He's a brilliant student from the top one university in France, and he was fed up with what he was doing at Sun with Java. He was seeing that Sun was doing some really cool stuff with Java, but he wanted more. So he resigned for Sun from Sun, and he decided to create his own company. JBoss wrote this application server with a couple of friends, made it available for free, and they live off of selling services around this stuff. That's it, consulting and training and installation, and that's it. And then Red Hat bought him, and now he's retired. He's younger than I am. So it works well. I mean, you can make a lot of money, and investors know that. There are a lot of cases where this has happened. MySQL, freely available. Now Oracle is making commercial elements of MySQL, so they've turned it into freemium, but the original MySQL was free, and the only thing they were living off is selling services and support. And Sun bought MySQL for a shitload of money. So VCs understand that model really well. Okay. One thing that's interesting in that optic here of services is that in the open source world, everybody can offer service on an open source product. That's what Wipro does, right? We sell services over Apache, Tomcat, Elasticsearch, Red Hat, and a few of our key partners. So, of course, here we compete directly with the services branches of these guys, as well as with other companies that offer services, right? And that's the beauty of open source is since the source code is accessible to everybody, everybody can grab the source code, learn, and offer services. This works extremely well, in particular in countries that are in development. And I remember at the time when I was at Sun, we had a visit from a few officials from KwaZulu-Natal. Now, KwaZulu-Natal, if you don't know what it is, it's one of the provinces in South Africa. South Africa isn't a really very rich country, but KwaZulu-Natal is even less rich. And they wanted to provide an office automation suite for the whole government there. And they came to us and said, look guys, we have a real problem. I'm sorry for the Microsoft people in the room, but they said, look, we don't want to pay hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in licenses that'll go directly to Redmond and not bring us any value, just to be allowed to run an office suite. What can we do? And at the time at Sun, we didn't have LibreOffice, we still had OpenOffice, and they told us, so could we do this with OpenOffice? It does the same thing as what we want to do in terms of functionality, but nobody knows it here. And Sun, you guys, you're not in KwaZulu-Natal. You basically barely have offices in South Africa, but you're not in KwaZulu-Natal. So we're stuck. So we said, no, you're not stuck. It's very simple. First, the source code is there, so you can read it. But more importantly, what we'll sell you is a little bit of consulting and training. We'll train a few people and make sure they know how to run this stuff, make sure they know where to find the source code, how to contribute patches, bug fixes, etc. And these guys, they're your citizens. Once they're trained, they can train more of your citizens. We don't want that money. We've trained them, we've sold them that training. Good, we're happy. They'll train more citizens. And those citizens, that's knowledge in your country, that's value, that's wealth in your country, it's education. And these citizens will train more citizens and more citizens. They will create a team of people who will then be able to support your government. And all of that is a virtuous circle because since they're training people in your country and your government is going to pay them, it's going to make your country generate more revenue and more rich wealth and more wealth. And they loved that idea, so that's what they did. So it's a great way to create wealth and knowledge because of making the source code available and empowering anybody to actually become an expert in something. So, you know, anyone who knows how to program can say, okay, what software, I like this one, I think it's being used by a lot of people, at least people around me use it, I'm going to learn all about it, I'm going to become an expert, and I'm going to sell these services. And anybody's allowed to do that. Some companies, even in the open source world, like the Document Foundation now, has a certification program where if you've done just that, read the source code or enough of it, and become an expert in something, there's a company in France called Star Expert, and they're specializing in migration. They can go to a customer that's running Microsoft Office, and they will help them migrate their environment to an open office or LibreOffice environment. And by the way, this is something I heard not too long ago, and I think it's extremely important. Migration is all about change. It's not about replacing, it's about change. If you're migrating from one tool to another, it's because you want what the other has to offer, which is hopefully better. If you're doing a migration to get exactly the same thing, why bother, right? Keep what you have. So when they're going to do a migration from one environment to the other, that company is going to audit what's running, figure out what documents are doing, what they need in terms of macros, etc. They're going to analyze all that, and then they're going to write a plan. They're going to say we can migrate all of these documents, but those can still run on one machine that still have Microsoft Office if you want, and that will move to, etc. So that's an expertise that they gain by working on this kind of project. And now they've been certified by the Document Foundation to do that for LibreOffice as well. So the Document Foundation has a list of certified partners. It's better if you're there, but you don't have to be. I mean, if you're the expert, and that's it. So that's services. The next model is the embedded model. So the embedded model is very simple. It's what I mentioned earlier about Linksys or Sourcefire. It's having your open source product pre-integrated into something. So for example, Linux integrated into a little Wi-Fi router. Sony, when you buy a Sony camcorder, it has a very nice graphical user interface with menus on the screen and touchscreens. All that's written in Java. So what do? They embed a Java virtual machine, which is OpenJDK, it's open source, inside a camcorder. When you buy a DVD, not a DVD, a Blu-ray, all of the menu and the interactions in the Blu-ray is a Java program. So Java is embedded in the Blu-ray player, and when you launch the DVD, it takes Blu-ray, it takes ages to load because they're first loading the Java program from the Blu-ray into the machine that then boots it, starts running it, then you get your very fancy menus and things and all kinds of nice things. But this is what they're doing. They're embedding an open source code, the Java virtual machine, inside the product. And that can be done for all kinds of things. So it's typically a way of saying, I've made some really complex but useful stuff, and it's going to become part of something that everybody can use because it's packaged into a device that does something. Your typical car today has a whole bunch of embedded software in there. Probably a lot of it is open source, actually. So that's a great way. It could be also a library that's embedded into another piece of code. So a piece of open source software, we were mentioning that a few minutes ago during the discussion. A piece of open source software that gets often embedded into other applications is something called the libpcap, which is a library used in network applications like network scanners and things like that. It's a great library, provides functionality. It has a cool license that lets you talk to it without having to contaminate your code. And somebody wrote it. It's a lot of work that went into writing it, and now people embed that into their own code. It could be a dictionary. A dictionary in your language could be something that is embedded by a word processing application. You name it. So that's a really, really cool way of making a piece of software available to somebody through somebody else. Licensing, when you embed, licensing is a serious issue. So you have to be very careful with what you do. When the first OpenOffice program came around, the dictionaries were not available as open source, freely redistributable. So we had the right to redistribute one dictionary with OpenOffice as open source. So when you got OpenOffice freely, you got one dictionary. That's it. You could go online and download another one, but we didn't have the right to redistribute them all at the same time bundled. If you bought OpenOffice commercial edition from us, then we had the right to do that, and we shipped it with all of the dictionary. So that was one value add. And we could say, with the commercial version, we embed all of these dictionaries. It's easier for you, so it's worth paying for it. If you're not going to pay for it, you'll have to download whatever dictionary you want extra. Take the time. And licensing was an issue in there. And when the LibreOffice gang started working on LibreOffice, I don't know if you remember, but the first version was LGPL. So we actually had a dual license, GPL and LGPL, and the LGPL was used for the plugin APIs, including the dictionaries. LibreOffice was the first one to actually say, we can ship all of the dictionaries now because they connect through the LGPL. And then starting version 4, they moved to MPL, and then we can bundle anything in it. They can bundle anything in it. So keep in mind that embedding is really tricky from a licensing perspective. But if you want to make money, it's a great way, because find somebody who's going to sell millions of your copies of code embedded into their system. There you have it. You have a regular revenue from somebody else who's doing all the work for you. That's really cool. Finally, the last model The last model that you can use for making money, sort of, out of open source is called stewardship. And I've linked there with sponsorship and funding. It's basically saying, okay, I'm not going to actually sell my software or sell support on my software. What I'm going to do is I'm going to find a really great program out there, great project that is open source, and I'm going to get involved in it. So I'm going to contribute to it, time, resources, marketing, branding, you name it. And by doing that, funding it, actually, I could give money to it or sponsor it or give engineers. By doing that, my reputation around this software is going to grow. And so, for example, if I were a company in the old days, Nokia, does anybody still have a Nokia phone here? No? They made great phones. You could actually throw them from the 26th floor and they would still work when they landed. Do that with an Android phone now, or an iPhone. Anyway, so they made these great phones, and when Java started appearing in these phones, they really got involved into it. And the aim for a company like Nokia to get strongly involved in Java and participate in the working group around the APIs is they got known as being a company that knows Java as well. So if somebody wanted to get a phone that ran Java really well, Nokia was a very good option. People thought that because they did it so well, their phones had to run Java very well. Sun did the same thing. We made Java, I mean, we really did it. Actually, initially it was for a commercial product, and then the company didn't want it, so we decided we have this pile of code here. What are we going to do? Nope. Okay, let's turn this into something for everybody else, and we called it Java. And then we open sourced it a long time after. It was a hard process, but by open sourcing it and then getting involved into it without selling it anymore, made Sun become the company for running Java application servers like JBoss, like Tomcat, and things like that. That's what we hoped, at least, and that worked to some extent. So, so it's really a way of saying, I'm not going to make directly money from it, but I'm going to generate, consider it like marketing. You get indirect revenue from your marketing. Well, that's what you get out of a stewardship. You raise the reputation, you make the project better, then people come to you because they think you're the expert. And then you can sell consulting or hardware or something totally unrelated, but they still come to you for that. Okay, so this is my last slide with my email address. Write it down if you want a copy of the presentation and send me an email, or if you have questions afterwards. But I think we still have a bit of time for questions, probably until past or something like that. So if you have questions, I'm here.
How old were you when you joined the Sun Microsystems?
How old was I? It was in 1994. So 1994, I was 29. Yeah.
After you finished college directly?
No. When I finished college, I started working for a company that developed sonars for the French nuclear submarines. And my customer was the Army, and they were a boring customer because I tried to do fun things, like develop an interface for sonars, and they wanted to see it. So I plugged in a database of whale sounds and dolphin sounds, and they didn't like my stuff at all. They turned that off. So it's not fun working for the Army, but the project itself was really cool. I did programming in Fortran and Ada. For those of you who knows Ada? 1, 2 hands, 3 hands. Yeah. So that was really cool, actually, but intense. Then I did a few more things in the process before joining Sun. Oh, Sun.
Oracle.
No, I hated that. Oracle, when I joined them, I said, this is what I want to do. I want to develop an open source strategy for business development in the public sector. And the guy said, yes. I joined them. And then when I joined Oracle, and I have to be careful because this is being filmed. When I joined Oracle, I realized that it wasn't as easy as I had expected to do open source in a company that sees open source more in a tactical way than a strategic way. So So I wasn't happy there. I mean, it's a great experience. It's a great company. It just wasn't for me. I was coming from Sun. I was used to doing everything in a fun, team way, collaboration, etc. Oracle doesn't work the same way. Sun used to communicate on everything. We had blogs, we had open source development. Oracle, everything is closed. It's a very different beast, and I wasn't happy there. So I moved to something else. Yeah. From what I see at Wipro, it's a really cool company. Everything is, there's a very strong emphasis on ethics, on sustainability, and I like that a lot. I think it's important for me. Not everybody is like that, but for me, it's important to work in a company for which I adhere to the ethics, and what they're doing at Wipro is very cool. So time will tell if it's as cool after being there for a few months as it is after a few weeks. It's Sun was a really cool company to work for.
And that was in France, right?
So I joined Sun in France, but after 2 years I moved to Switzerland, and in Switzerland I was in an international role for all of my time. So I happened to be based in the Swiss office, but my customers were from Japan to San Francisco and Australia and South Africa. The only continental block, apart from Antarctica, that I didn't go to was South America for some strange reason that I don't know, but everywhere else. So. How is open source? I think Asia, I can't generalize by Asia. It's such a big difference. It's a different countries and cultures. Let me give you an example of what happened when I was in China. First time I went to China to talk about open source of an operating system, somebody came to me at the end of my presentation and told me, aren't you afraid that people are going to steal your code? And I looked at him and I said, you know what? It's going to be really hard to steal it because we're giving it away. So, what do you want me to say, you know? So, but it's interesting though, because when you're doing open source, and past this bit of humor, when you're doing open source, it opens a new market, right? If your product is going to be purely commercial and you have to pay for it, then of course people who don't have the money or who don't want to pay the money, sometimes it's the richest who steal, will want to make pirate copies of it and run it because they can steal it. When you're doing open source, it's slightly different because, first of all, those who don't have the money to pay for it, who would not be your customers normally, well, they can download it for free and they can use it for free. They wouldn't be your customers, so you're not making any more money from them than you would with a proprietary software. Why do you care? Then you have, on the other hand, the ones who have a lot of money and who would have gladly paid for your software because it's critical for their business and they understand that they need support. Well, these guys with the open source software, they'll pay for support. So you're going to get money from them because they're not about to start building their Amazon.com and have their servers fail on December 23rd when everybody's buying from them. They want support for that. So the guys who are ready to pay, same thing. They will pay for support, they will pay for consulting, they will pay for help. They will be commercial customers. And then you have in the middle the guys who don't know. They probably would like it if they tried it, but they don't want to try because they'd have to pay for something that they're not sure they would want to use. And these guys with open source, they have a chance. They can download it for free, they can start using it, and that's what is called adoption in the open source world. It's not you pay to use my stuff, it's once you've tried it for free and you like it, you've adopted it. And then you say, okay, I really love this stuff. I'm going to deploy it in production and it's going to become the heart of my IT environment. That's when I'm going to need support. So I'm going to call the vendor and say, who can I call for support 24/7? Oh, well, this number, but you have to pay that much. And then everybody's happy. So that's something that I had to explain to the guys in China because they had a different frame of mind, obviously. And some countries have different laws in terms of copyright and things like that. So of course, you publish your code, and you'd like somebody to respect the CDDL or the MPL or the GPL, and sometimes somebody won't. Suppose that the Chinese, I'm going to say Chinese because that happened in China, but suppose a Chinese company decide to take my open source code and integrate that into a commercial product and not publish the source code. Fine. Okay, they're going to do that in China. Fine, it's a billion user market. It's a great market, but I can't do anything there, basically. I mean, not as a Western company. Now, when they start selling their product in Europe, suppose Huawei starts selling routers in Europe, which they do, or cell phones, then what is going to happen is that my lawyers in Europe are going to come and say, you really need to do something about your source code here, because there's a whole bunch of GPL stuff in there that I like to see. And if you want to keep doing business in Europe, rules here. So this is what happens. For as long as it's in a country where law doesn't work the same way as I want it to work, whatever, I don't care. And it's when they come in my country where I have the means of stopping them, and the rest of the world is pretty big if they want to do business in it. Then I have a means of pressure. So every country has different rules. Open source is really nice because it gives power to everybody to do it. People share knowledge, people share software, people share expertise. They create community, they email. In Singapore, it was really great to see how many people were exchanging stuff, communicating, and so I don't want to say something specific for Asia because, as I said, there's not a specific Asia, but in everywhere, what I see is that open source makes people talk to each other. And even if you have a license, like BSD, which doesn't force anybody to contribute back, actually the communities around BSDs are very, very active, and they do it not because they're forced by a GPL, like where you have to contribute everything you modify or you add, but because of a true community spirit. So it really is a great thing to see, and you see that everywhere actually. So the CERN OHL is the CERN Open Hardware License. And the company I used to work for before was doing their spin-off of the quantum physics lab of the University of Geneva, and they're doing quantum physics-based cryptography tools, really, really complex stuff. But one of their teams is creating a product which is called EasyFi, and it's a little platform, hardware platform, that allows people to build electronic equipment, experimental equipment, or commercial equipment on an open source base. So the open source base, open source hardware, has the CERN Open Hardware License, which is a GPL for hardware if you want. So it contaminates everything that's plugged into it, and one of the complex discussion we had is how do we set a limit on the physical hardware to bring something like an LGPL to it, if you want. Because they wanted people to be able to write open source stuff on it, which was easy, but also plug in proprietary hardware. It's a tricky thing. With the open hardware license, open hardware doesn't allow that. So you have to think of things like an artificial connector, like a mezzanine connector on the hardware. So yes, you can have open source for hardware. I've seen open source houses, open source beers, colas.
Have you heard of the OSCE, the Open Source Circular Economy Day?
Nope.
No?
Nope.
They're coming to Malaysia soon.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a very big event, 5-day event in Europe, Berlin, Paris, London. Never heard of it?
So it's like this, when you start talking to startups, there's always somebody coming to you and say, did you see these guys? They're doing something really cool. Nope. But then you say, but do you see those guys? No, they're doing something cool too. So it's always like that. I mean, you can't know it all, but yeah. So OS, how do you say?
OSCED.
OSCED.
Yes.
Okay.
Open Source Circular Economy Day.
If you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin is almost, it's not called like that, but it's almost an open source currency. I mean, the algorithms, the bit chain, everything is publicly documented, available in source code. you can actually take the whole source code for the Bitcoin blockchain, etc., and create a parallel currency that you'll call MyCoin, and it works just as well. So yeah, open source is available. The concept of open source is available for just about everything. And one thing that works really well with open source is what is called open innovation. It's having companies work together and exchanging in an open way knowledge to help both of them build something that one couldn't do by itself. And it's sometimes a little tricky because some of these companies don't like sharing their secrets. So they try to find orthogonal areas where the sharing of information won't have an impact. So one example that I can give, because it was in a public discussion, so I'll mention it here, was the group, the Martini group, the guys who make the Martini and Bacardi, the drinks, and the guys from Procter & Gamble had a discussion on a virtual project, but I'm pretty sure it mapped to something more real behind. And Martini was looking for a partner who had expertise in creating something that can, and packaging something that could have two different liquids separated, but that could be mixed instantly. Now I can let you imagine, how you could build, how you could sell a cocktail that has the two components or three or more components separated by something, and then you buy it, you shake it, and you make your live cocktail. Or I don't know what Martini had in mind, to be honest. But it's interesting because they went and talked, these two companies that do completely different things. I mean, Procter & Gamble does, dishwashing machine powders and things like that. Actually, when they had the discussion, Procter & Gamble had just announced this new bags of, their plastic bags that contain multiple products for washing your laundry. And when you put it in water, they would each dilute at different phases. So they had the knowledge to do that, which was what led to that discussion. So open innovation works really well in the open source world because you don't have that barrier of saying we have to find which information we can share and which we have to protect, because in the open source world you're already sharing the information. So you can have two companies who are developing in open source, work together, share the knowledge very easily, and join forces to develop something even better. So think about it if you're going to work in an open source environment. Look at opportunities to work in an open innovation context. There are groups. There's a UK company called Catalyx that has an initiative called 100% Open, and they do open innovation work groups for companies. So it's really, really interesting. It lets you speed up development by sharing knowledge very nicely.
We'll take the last question.
So this is regarding applying the license itself. So if we were to wanted to open source our software, so do we just declare all these licenses there, or do we need an authorized body to actually legalize it?
Say it again because I didn't hear everything.
This is if we were to applying licenses in our software that we wrote.
Yep.
Do we just declare the license just like that?
Exactly.
Or do we need an authorized body to
Nope.
legalize it?
No. It's a software license is a unilateral contract that you propose. So you write software. Of course, it has to be your software because you cannot apply a license to somebody else's stuff. But if you create something, you write the software, it's your own intellectual property, then you have the right to do whatever you want with it. So you can actually have this notion of dual license, even if you want. You can actually say, I'm going to make this available for with two different licenses if you want. You decide. And the only thing is that if you create your own license, you have to be really careful. You usually want a lawyer with that because you want to make sure that your license doesn't include things that are not enforceable or not conflicting or not realistic, which is why it's usually much easier to go to open source initiative or opensource.org, find one that looks like what you want and use it. But if you do that, you find a license that you like, that's all you need to do. If you're going to make your application available to people, you have to have the license file attached or a pointer to the license. And if you're going to make the source code available, you should have inside each of your files somewhere in the header something that says this file has this license. But you don't need anybody to do that. It's your choice.
But so what's the persistence of the license? So can I declare it like FreeBSD this week and then GPL next week?
You can?
Oh, really?
Yeah. You choose. Typically, what happens is some companies will move the license from one mode to another. That's what I said for OpenOffice, LibreOffice. Version 3.6 was LGPL and below, 3.5, etc. And then when version 4.0 arrived, we moved everything, they moved everything to the Mozilla public license. It took some time because they had to get the permission. So the LGPL allows relicensing with a compatible license. That's the notion of compatible license is a complex one, but it's two licenses are compatible if you can use both, and you're allowed to relicense to another one. So we were allowed to do that. We had to check with the developers. I think there were like 3 of the people in the 900 developer team that didn't want their code to be MPL, so we just removed their code and rewrote. They were patches. We rewrote those patches differently so that we didn't use any of their code, and then MPL that. But you can. Nessus that decided to go from an open source license in version 2 to a proprietary version in 3.0. It has to be a different version. You can add a new license, but usually when you make a significant change, it's good practice to change the version. Okay? I mean, suppose you have a version 2.0 which is GPL and a version 2.0 which is MPL. It's going to confuse everybody. You can. I mean, you can always.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
You can't make any changes to the software, but you just like you just have a change of
Well,
that you want.
considering that the license should be, to do well, should be in the source code, in the headers of every file, you at least have to change the header of every file. So you could do that. You can generate 2 version 3.5.01 of the software with a different license line in it and have 2 separate packages. That's okay. I mean, you can do that. And you can say you can download this version and download this one. We will sell support for this one. We don't sell support for that one. Fine. And by the, for example, you want to encourage people to use the GPL version, because when they use the GPL version, if they add that to their software has to become GPL. So you could have an MPL version for hackers and the same version exactly GPL for which you sell support. Then you tell your customers, okay, you can download any one of those, but if you want support, you have to be using the GPL version. It's your code, it's your intellectual property. You do whatever you want with it.
If I may add a little bit, if you release your older code, open source, and then you change the license, whoever get that copy will get it on the older license. So you need to remember that.
Yeah.
So you cannot, for example, release your code open source and then somebody take it and you change your license to closed source. Whoever get your code, they still remain with the open source license. You cannot enforce a new license on the older code.
Right. And last thing along those lines is, keep in mind that you cannot remove an older version, right? Suppose you have version 4 that is out now, and version 3 was open source. Even if you delete version 3 from your servers, because it was open source and people had the right to copy it, you cannot force them to delete it. Once they have it, they can make as many copies as they want, they can archive it everywhere they want, and you are not allowed, you cannot force them to remove it, because you gave them, with the license, the right to do it, which is what happened with Nessus. They would have loved to remove version 2 from the planet of the Earth. They couldn't.
Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, let's give Gilles a round of applause.